Imagine this. You're sitting in your seat at 24,000 feet. You just unbuckled your seatbelt to relax and catch a glimpse of the ocean. Drinks are being served. You hear the clinking of glasses and the low hum of voices. And then, the sky literally falls on you. In a single second, your plane turns into a convertible, screaming through the air at 300 miles per hour. No roof, no connection to the cockpit, and right under your feet, the endless void of the Pacific Ocean. This isn't a scene from a horror movie or some CGI glitch. This is the terrifying true story of Aloha Flight 243. Today, we're breaking it down minute by minute, how this cardboard castle managed to land, and why one tiny, overlooked rivet almost killed 100 people. Meet the main character of this tragedy, a Boeing 737-200, tail number N73711, proudly named the Queen Liliuokalani. By April 1988, this queen was 19 years old. In the aviation world, that's mature, but not necessarily critical. However, there was one number that made engineers very nervous. This aircraft had completed 89,680 flights, what we call takeoff and landing cycles. At the time, that was the second highest record in the world for this model. Because of how things work in the Hawaiian Islands, flights only lasted 20 to 30 minutes. The plane was constantly taking off and landing, which meant the fuselage was constantly expanding from pressure and then shrinking back down. Imagine bending an aluminum soda can back and forth thousands of times. Eventually, the metal just gives up. This was metal fatigue, made even worse by the salty, humid ocean air that had been corroding the rivets from the inside for years. There were 95 people on board that day, 90 passengers and 5 crew members. In the captain's seat was 44-year-old Robert Schornsteimer, an experienced pilot with over 8,500 hours on the Boeing 737, a man of iron nerves. Beside him was First Officer Mimi Tompkins. At 37, she was already an Aloha Airlines veteran with 8,000 flight hours under her belt. Working the cabin were 3 flight attendants. The legendary Clarabelle Lansing, who had given 37 years of her life to aviation, Jane Sato Tomita, and Michelle Honda. They had no idea their plane was tired of living. Here's a chilling fact from the NTSB report. One passenger, Libby Tomita, later admitted that while boarding in Hilo, she noticed a thin crack on the fuselage near the front door. She saw it, but said nothing to the crew, thinking, well, the experts checked the plane, they know best. That tiny crack was the beginning of the end for the top of the aircraft. 1:25 p.m. local time. Flight 243 taxis onto the runway at Hilo Airport. The weather is perfect. Just another sunny day in the islands. None of the 90 passengers on board realize they are sitting inside a massive time bomb, where the detonator is the air pressure itself. At 1:33 p.m., Captain Robert Schornsteimer hands the controls to First Officer Mimi Tompkins. This was her takeoff. The Boeing 737 smoothly lifts off and begins its climb. The plane passes 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000. At this altitude, the difference between the pressure inside the cabin and the thin air outside becomes massive. The fuselage expands like a balloon, putting agonizing stress on the very rivets that had been corroding from sea salt for years. 1:48 p.m. The plane reaches its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. The pilots level off and begin standard procedures. In the cabin, the fasten seatbelt sign goes dark. Flight attendants Clarabelle Lansing, Michelle Honda, and Jane Sato Tomita start serving drinks. Clarabelle is standing in the aisle at row 5, the business class section. She was handing a glass of water to a passenger when it happened. Without any warning, a sound erupted that survivors described as a cannon blast right next to your ear. In the next second, explosive decompression hit. The plane's fuselage didn't just crack, it shredded. A section of the upper left skin, nearly 20 feet long, literally vanished. It was a domino effect. As soon as one rivet failed, the neighboring ones began popping out like bullets. A massive chunk of the roof peeled back and was swept into the sky. It was a moment of absolute horror. Anyone not buckled in felt themselves lifted out of their seats. Clarabelle Lansing was standing right at the epicenter of the breach. The rush of air blasting out under extreme pressure instantly pulled her from the plane. She never stood a chance. Clarabelle became the only fatality of this flight, and her body would never be found. The other two flight attendants, Michelle and Jane, were slammed to the floor. Jane was struck by debris and knocked unconscious. Michelle, despite the shock and her injuries, managed to grab onto the legs of the seats. She literally crawled through the cabin, helping passengers who were covered in blood from flying insulation and jagged metal. Inside the cockpit, it was a nightmare. Captain Schornsteimer turned around and froze. Instead of the cabin door, he saw blue sky and the tail of the plane. There was no way to talk to the crew. Radioing the ground was nearly impossible because of the deafening roar of the wind. The airspeed was over 300 miles per hour. The temperature instantly plummeted to minus 45 degrees. The pilots were in thin shirts, without oxygen masks. But the scariest part? The entire plane was being held together by nothing but the thin floor beams. The roof provides 30% of the structural stiffness. Now the Queen Liliuokalani had turned into a flexible aluminum tube, bending with every gust of wind. At 1:49 p.m., the sky over Hawaii turned into a battlefield. Captain Robert Schornsteimer and First Officer Mimi Tompkins were facing a situation no flight simulator in the world prepares you for. Imagine, you're flying at 300 miles per hour in a seat that is literally hanging over an abyss. There is no roof, no back wall to the cockpit, and the wind is so violent it's ripping oxygen masks right out of your hands. The first problem: hypoxia. At 24,000 feet, the air is too thin to survive. The pilots had only a couple of minutes before their brains would shut down from lack of oxygen. Schornsteimer immediately deployed the spoilers and pushed the Boeing into a steep dive. He had to drop to 10,000 feet just to reach breathable air. But then came a deadly dilemma. The faster they descended, the harder the oncoming wind slammed into the mangled fuselage. The plane started to physically warp. The nose section was wobbling independently of the tail. One sharp move, and the aircraft would snap in half like a dry twig. Inside the cabin, things were beyond human comprehension. Passengers in the front rows weren't looking at a ceiling. They were looking at racing clouds. Shards of metal and chunks of insulation were whipping through the aisle, leaving people with jagged lacerations. Flight attendant Michelle Honda, despite a head injury, was crawling through the cabin from one passenger to the next. She forced people into life vests and literally strapped them into their seats so they wouldn't be sucked out of the hole after Clarabelle. Mimi Tompkins tried to reach air traffic control. She was screaming into the mic, but because of the deafening roar of the wind, the controllers only heard fragments of her voice. The controller in Kahului could see on his radar that Flight 243 was losing altitude fast, but he didn't yet know the plane was half destroyed. As the plane reached the safety of 10,000 feet, a new disaster struck. The left engine flamed out. It had swallowed debris from the fuselage. Now they were down to a single motor. But that wasn't all. When they tried to lower the landing gear, the nose gear light failed to turn green. The pilots had no way of knowing if the wheel was locked. Landing on the belly with a ripped open fuselage would be a guaranteed explosion. Schornsteimer made the call. They were going in on the first try. There would be no second chance. The pilots couldn't even hear each other speak. They communicated through gestures and nods. Mimi managed the engine thrust while Robert fought the yoke with everything he had. The runway was less than a mile away. 1:58 p.m. Exactly 13 minutes have passed since the explosion. The main landing gear slams onto runway 02 at Kahului Airport with a deafening thud. But this was no ordinary landing. As soon as the nose gear touched the tarmac, Captain Schornsteimer felt the front of the plane dangerously sag. The fuselage began to buckle under its own weight. It felt like the Boeing was about to fold in half right there on the runway. The aircraft screamed across the scorching asphalt at nearly 180 miles per hour. The pilots couldn't slam on the brakes. A sudden stop could create an inertial jolt that would finally rip the cockpit clean off. When the plane finally came to a halt, there was no silence. Only the hiss of steam, the groans and the cries of people who finally realized they were on the ground. Out of the 95 people on board, 94 were alive. But Kahului Airport wasn't ready for a disaster of this scale. They simply didn't have enough ambulances. There were only 2 units for 65 injured passengers. The medics realized they were running out of time. And that's when everyone stepped in. Drivers from Akamai Tours diverted their tour buses straight to the plane. Ordinary vans and pickup trucks became improvised ambulances. Passengers were carried out by hand and laid across the bus seats. Flight attendant Michelle Honda, despite a serious head injury, refused help until she was certain every single person had cleared the deck. She was the last of the crew to step onto the ground. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard began scouring the ocean for Clarabelle Lansing. But the Pacific is unforgiving. Clarabelle remained a part of this tragedy, vanishing forever into the deep blue. By evening, images of the convertible plane in the rays of the setting sun had stunned the entire world. 2:15 p.m., only 15 minutes since the engines cut out. The last of the wounded have just been whisked away by buses. Kahului Airport has turned into a high-security zone. As firefighters douse the runway with foam, the first experts approach the wreckage. This wasn't a late-night investigation. This was work under the scorching, unforgiving Hawaiian sun. The investigators stood before the aircraft in total shock. The first theory was obvious: terrorism. But chemical analysis found no trace of explosives. Physics had torn this plane apart. Investigators uncovered terrifying facts. Aloha Airlines had been running their planes into the ground. The epoxy adhesive bonding the fuselage panels had dissolved in the salty ocean air. The entire load shifted to the rivets. The hull was constantly breathing, expanding, and contracting. Under an electron microscope, experts saw thousands of microcracks, thinner than a human hair. They called them multiple site fatigue damage. Individually, each crack was harmless. But when they lined up along a row of rivets, the fuselage turned into a perforated sheet of paper. It turned out that inspections were done at night, in dark hangars, and the technicians simply didn't see them. This incident became the point of no return. New protocols were created. Now inspectors are required to use ultrasound and X-rays. The term aging aircraft officially entered the textbooks. We learned about the titanium fail-safe straps, the reinforcement belts that acted like a fuse that day, stopping the crack before it reached the wings. And we remembered Libby Tomita, the passenger who saw the crack back in high-low but was too afraid of looking foolish to say a word. Her silence was a lesson for us all. Clarabelle Lansing became a part of the sky forever, a 58-year-old woman who dedicated nearly 4 decades to the air. She was the heart and soul of her airline. Today, a pavilion at Honolulu International Airport is named in her honor, and her story is the first thing new flight attendants learn. But the greatest monument to Clarabelle and Flight 243 is the lives of the millions of people who board planes today. We fly in the safest era of aviation, specifically because of the bitter lessons learned on that sunny day in 1988. Captain Robert Schornsteimer and Mimi Tompkins proved one thing: there is no room for panic in a cockpit, even when the laws of physics are working against you. The story of Aloha 243 reminds us that safety isn't an accident. It's the result of thousands of mistakes that were carefully studied. On this channel, we dive deep into the world's most complex incidents. If you believe that knowing history is the best way to prevent future disasters, hit that subscribe button. We work to make sure every single incident is broken down to the very last rivet. Let us know in the comments what shocked you the most: the heroism of the pilots or the silence of that passenger. Your thoughts help us make these investigations even deeper. Take care of yourselves, check the details, and remember, in aviation, there is no such thing as a minor detail. See you in the next episode.